Good morning. First thing we're going to do this morning is I'm going to show you a picture. And when you see the picture up on the wall, I would like you to look for the face in the picture. Not everyone can see the face in the picture, and it's not always easy to see, but I want you to look for the face. Kelsey, if you would put the picture up on the wall. Do you see the face, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth? Good. Okay, Kelsey, you can turn that off. We'll come back to that in a little bit. John 9. Thank you, Linda, for bringing this presentation to us of Scripture in this way. John 9 is a story about a man who's born blind, and I just want to set the scene for you a little bit here at the beginning. The disciples are walking down the street with Jesus, and they come upon this man who's been born blind. How they know he was born blind, I don't know. If they saw him, kind of knew of him maybe. But they're walking down the street, and they run into this guy who's blind. And the disciples think to themselves, I imagine, well, good, this is the perfect opportunity to ask Jesus the rabbi, who we've been learning from all along, this pressing question of, well, is it the blind man's fault, or is it the parents' fault? And I imagine that the disciples had heard this, maybe overheard rabbis debating this topic, or as they grew up, they knew that for some reason, if there's a tragedy, there's usually someone at fault. And they thought, this is a perfect opportunity to ask Jesus, our rabbi, figure this out. Whose fault is it? So they ask him, and Jesus says, you're asking the wrong question. It's not at all about whose fault it is, or putting each of the people in this scenario in a category. It's about me and me showing my light and bringing healing to this blind man. If you could show the picture again. Now, some of the reason that people don't always see the face in this picture is because they are reading the word in the picture. Can anyone see the word that's written there? It's in white. It's in cursive. What's the word? Liar. That's right. Liar. And the disciples only saw from one perspective, and that was that the man was born blind and there had to be a fault. And I told you I wanted you to see the face, and so sometimes what we are told is what we see. And we miss a perspective that is another perspective. And I think Jesus was trying to say to the disciples, you're missing the perspective that I want you to see, that I'm going to heal this guy. And it strikes me that the disciples are walking down the street. They're with a healer. They've seen Jesus do miracles. They see a man with a need. He's got blindness. And they decide to have a theological discussion. Wow. Here's this guy who needs God's touch. And the disciples are talking about theology. And they miss the perspective that Jesus had, because they've been told all along that there's only one perspective. And Jesus says, no, open up your eyes. I want you to see what I'm doing. You can turn that off then. There was a movement of God, and they almost missed it because they were only looking from their own perspective and missed God's perspective. Jesus goes on to heal this guy in a very earthy kind of way, and I like that about Jesus because I'm kind of an earthy kind of person, and he used very physical, earthy way to heal him. He gets down on his knees, he gets some mud, he spits in it, he puts it on the guy's face, on his eyes, and he tells him to go wash it off in the pool of Siloam. Now, the pool of Siloam was created in the reign of King Hezekiah when there was a siege on the city, and he diverted one of the springs from outside the city into the city so the people could have water. It kept the enemies outside the city from having water, and it gave the people that were living there water during the siege, and it formed a pool. Now, this pool in Jesus' day was probably used for ritual washing, maybe for getting water. Could have been a Roman bath, it's not sure, but it's to this pool that Jesus sends the blind man, and he is supposed to wash. And so he goes there, and he washes it off the clay off his eyes, and he is healed. He can see. And this also happens to be on the Sabbath. But Jesus is no longer around. Jesus has sent him away to go wash. And so the man goes home, and he starts to tell the townspeople who are in a dither, what is this? Here's this guy who they've been watching all their lives, being led through the streets by maybe his parents when he was a child. He's been begging in the marketplace. Maybe they even knew him when he was born and what his parents were dealing with when they had a child that was blind. So they're confused. Here's this guy saying, I'm healed, I see. He looks like the born blind man. They all knew, but it does not make any sense. So they take him, they say, let's take him to our spiritual leaders. Let's take him to the Pharisees. Let's figure this out. We got to figure this out. We have to know what's going on. And they take him to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees don't really help matters. And they bring in the parents, and they blame the parents, and you saw the whole story here unfold before you as they first call him the expert, that he should know what happened, and by the end of it, they're calling him dirt and kicking him out of the synagogue. Now let me tell you something about the Pharisees. The Pharisees were a group of people who were formed during a time of the Hellenistic, the Greek influence on Jewish culture, and they were afraid that they were going to lose their Jewish religion because of this influence, and so they were formed to keep the religion pure. The Pharisees formed it, and they thought that if they could keep this religion pure enough, they could hasten the coming of the Messiah. In fact, there was one Pharisee, or some Pharisees I read, there were a few who believed that if they kept the whole law, if everybody in Israel for one Sabbath day kept the whole law, no one sinned at all, then the Messiah would come. So they're a bit furious when Jesus comes along and heals on the Sabbath, because if he were truly the Messiah, he would know, he would certainly wait another 6 hours till the Sabbath was over, or maybe do it the next day, because this guy was born blind. And it wasn't an emergency. He wasn't falling off a cliff and Jesus was reaching out and saving him and breaking the Sabbath. He was this way for 20 years. And Jesus decides to do it on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees, there's no way. There's no way this guy can be the Messiah. And there's probably a little bit of self-righteousness in them too, because they figured that if they kept things pure, and they hastened the Messiah, then the Messiah's coming was going to be all about them. So I think there was a little bit of that going on in them too. Now, lest we are too hard on these guys, the Pharisees, which we are, because we have lots of stories about them, let me tell you a little bit of a story about myself. When I was a teenager growing up, young adult, a teenager, I was a rule keeper. And I knew exactly what to do to be a good Christian. I was certain how to stay away from certain evils of rock music and dancing, and I could give you the list. I had a list, maybe not conscious, but it was in there of what to do if you're a good Christian, and if you're not a good Christian, you wouldn't do these behaviors. And I sort of like to hang out with people who believed a little bit like I did. So if you didn't meet my list, then I didn't hang out with you. And if you did, I probably did. And I was pretty letter of the law. And eventually living when you live like that, it's a safe way to live, because when you follow the rules, you know what to do, and you know what category to put people in. But it's just also is a hard way to live. But I'm going to come back to that story later. Jesus will have none of this. He looks at the Pharisees and he says, I've come to make things clear. I've come to help those who are blind to see me. And I've come to point out to those who are pretentious and claim to understand everything and know everything, and I want to show them their blindness. Now, Jesus called the Pharisees blind in Matthew 13, I believe it is, when he talked about the blind leading the blind. You've probably heard this story. But the Pharisees were playing fast and loose with God's commandments. The Pharisees in that scripture were they were supposed to be taking care of their parents, and instead of taking care of their parents, they were giving money to charity. So they were saying, well, we don't have any money to take care of our parents. We're not taking care of our parents because we gave it all away. We gave it to God. And Jesus says, you're the blind leading the blind, and he's hard on them. And in Matthew 23, they are tithing their spices. How many of you tithe your spices? Do you even know what spices you have? They were tithing their spices, and they forgot and they neglected justice and mercy and faithfulness. And Jesus said to them, you should have done both. You should have tithed your spices and remembered justice and mercy and faithfulness. And he calls them hypocrites, actors, blind. So the disciples say, well, we heard this before. This guy's calling us blind before. Is he doing, here he goes again. He's doing it again. And he said to them, you calling us blind, Jesus? Are you calling us blind? Come on, you did this before. No, Jesus said, I'm not calling you blind, because if you claim to see, if you are blind, you'd be blameless. I couldn't put you to fault, but because you claim to see, you'll be held accountable for every fault and failure. And that's how John 9 ends, right there. That's it. Does anybody know what John 10 is about? I bet there's some of you who know John 10. Anybody? What John 10 is, just off the top of your head? Oh, I thought you would. It's the story, Jesus tells a story. And he tells a story about the shepherd and the sheep. Now you know that story, right? Well, if you would read this scripture in the King James Version, you've probably heard this phrase growing up. Verily, verily, I say unto you, right? Heard that? That phrase is right there at the beginning of chapter 10. If you read it in the King James Version, if you have a different version, you're not going to see verily, verily, I say unto you. You'll see something more contemporary. But he says, verily, verily, I say unto you, and he goes into talking about the sheep and the shepherd. And whenever you see that phrase in Scripture, there is always a connection between what has just happened and what Jesus is going to say next. Always a connection. And so I was fascinated with this, because I started to see suddenly, I can't stop preaching at the end of chapter 9. I have to say something about chapter 10 because it's connected. It's connected. So let me read a little bit from chapter 10 for you. If I can find it here. If a person climbs over through the fence of a sheep pen instead of going through the gate, you know he's up to no good, a sheep rustler. The shepherd walks right up to the gate. The gatekeeper opens the gate to him, and the sheep recognize his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he gets them all out, he leads them. They follow because they are familiar with his voice. They won't follow a stranger's voice, but will scatter because they aren't used to the sound of it. And he goes on in verse 7 to say, I am the gate. Anyone who goes through me will be cared for. We're free to go in and out and find pasture. A thief is only there to steal and to kill. Wow. He says this, and you know what? There's some Pharisees still standing here. And I can't believe that they don't recognize themselves in this story as the hired man or the thief. They were supposed to take care of their flock, and they didn't. They made it more confusing. They didn't help people. Now, Jesus is pretty hard on the Pharisees. I mean, he's pointing that in that story. But I think Jesus maybe is also saying something to those of us who want to see ourselves as sheep in this story. And I think he's also saying something to us who see ourselves as sheep. This story is not about a bunch of hawks that have great eyesight and they go out and fly over the land and they see great things because God has given them great eyesight. It's not about hawks. It's about a shepherd and sheep, this story is. Now, this story, Jesus knows, he knows that we are all blind in some way or another, and he knows we need to listen and follow him, and he knows what we blind people need. We need a voice. We need a voice. I think I need to come back to my story now about how I was a rule keeper. Well, eventually that kind of it stopped working. It didn't sustain me. And it was a painful little journey along the way. Long journey, I should say. But I began to explore what grace meant. And so when you sang that song, Jerry, it was like, wow. I began to explore what grace meant. And as I was on this journey, one of the questions that emerged for me was, well, if it's not all about rule keeping, then what's following God about? If it's not all about following the letter of the law, then what does following Jesus mean? That's a little scary. It's a little exciting too. It's a little exciting too to ask that question. I wasn't safe in my categories anymore. I couldn't hide behind my set of rules to measure myself and everybody else. I needed to look at things with a new perspective. Now I have to follow the voice of the shepherd. And that's more complicated because I have to have a relationship and I have to listen. And I have to find life in the wide open spaces of going in and out, finding pasture. I need the shepherd. I have to hear his voice. That's what it's about now. What is following the voice of the shepherd about for me? And what is it following the voice of the shepherd about for you? I don't know what it's about for you, so I decided to say what it's a little bit about for me. Sometimes now, my friends are not all like me. And sometimes they have strange ideas, and sometimes they don't follow Jesus like I do. But you know what? I have wonderful, colorful, beautiful friends that interact with me and that give me things and I give them things, and Jesus has called me when they come into my life to love them. And it also means following Jesus, hearing the voice of the shepherd for me, has also meant that there are times when I know this is where God is calling me. I mean, there was a point in our life where Brian and I were that I was sure we are just following God. We're doing what he wants us to do, and it's his will. We're right there, and we're giving up stuff for God, and we're just doing his will. And then it just crashed, fell apart, and I found myself in plan B. Plan B? God, I'm supposed to be in plan A. I'm in plan B, and I don't like plan B, but I have to hear the voice of the shepherd, and he's speaking in plan B. That's what it's for me. That's what it's like for me. And following the voice of the shepherd is also being given the opportunity to preach, and feeling like it's something I wanted to do, but also feeling like I wasn't sure at the moment that I had anything to say. And deciding that, well, maybe I will just sit with what it feels like to say no. Right now is not the time for me because I don't really have anything to say. And then a day or two later, waking up and before the alarm, 5:30, furiously writing down what God's giving me and how he's inspiring me. And that's following the voice of the shepherd for me. I don't know what it is for you this morning. Do we come here needing God's healing touch because we're broken, like the blind man? Do we need to come to Jesus and say, Lord, I believe, and I want to start on a journey of listening to your voice? Or do we come as the disciples this morning, where our theology and our categories keep us from seeing the hurting people around us? Do we need to release our partial perspectives and ask for Jesus' perspective on the situations around us, recognizing the light of God and how he's moving? Or do we need to let go of our rule-keeping mentality, where our tendency is to be like the Pharisees, pretend we have it all together, and tempted to define ourselves by our set of rules while missing what God is revealing? However we may be blind this morning, and whoever you tend to identify with in this story, if you do, the invitation still stands. Know the shepherd. Listen to his voice, for he will certainly lead you and us in and out to find pasture.